الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to another discussion about al-Itibaa and avoiding and abandoning bigotry, partisanship, blind following, and fanaticism towards madhahib and ashkhas and people. Previously, we talked about some of the books that were authored in either aid of a particular madhab or imam or scholar, and books that were written in refutation of certain schools of jurisprudence, right? Based on many times the author's bigotry and fanaticism towards his madhab and his opposition towards other jurisprudence madhabs. So today we're going to dive a little further into the establishment and designation of certain schools or learning institutes or universities and or mosques for each madhab. Now imagine you're in the city of Manhattan in New York, and within a 5 mile radius there are 10 different masajid. One masjid for the Hanafis, one masjid for the Malikis, one masjid for the Shafi'is, one masjid for the Hanbalis, and they pray 4 different Jumas. Okay? Instead of congregating all together for Juma and solidifying the ranks, solidifying the hearts and the minds and the bodies. Okay? Many times, right, bigotry and sectarianism and partisanship and blind following of madhabs leads to, right, as we have been studying and talk about, leads to separation of the bodies, the minds, the hearts, okay, the souls. So many of the sectarian or madhab based schools or institutes, okay, and even some mosques throughout the world are among the material manifestations of this sectarian fanaticism, bigotry, blind following, and partisanship. Okay. And it was prevalent amongst the 4 Sunni schools of jurisprudence, the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, and the Hanbalis. And these institutions were visibly present and stood as tangible evidence of the extent to which each madhab, right, um, the level of, right, to the extent to which, the madhab expressed their partisanship, their bigotry, right, and blind following, how it had permeated these groups, so much so that each school, okay, each school of thought started to develop their own mosques, their own schools, okay, which only led to more division, more separation, reinforcing dissension, championing, okay, championing one's own school, while at the same time expressing hostility towards those who had different jurisprudence schools of thought. And the evidence throughout history, okay, within the Islamic history books is abundant, okay, from the, right, بخصوص al-Hanafiya, okay, the Hanafi madhab, and those who adhered to the Hanafi madhab, okay, they had many different schools and learning institutes that were specific only for teaching the Hanafi madhab. This was in Baghdad, Iraq. This was in Damascus, in um, Syria, and also in Egypt, okay, and other Muslim nations throughout the Islamic world. Okay, they had the famous the Madrasa al Khatuniya. Okay, they had the Madrasa al Iqbaliya, which was in Syria and Damascus, right? And they had over 50 of these different schools to promote their jurisprudence school of thought, right? You also had, right, Madrasa Mashhad Abi Hanifa and Madrasa Bab At-Taq, which was in Baghdad, Iraq. Okay, they also had, right, another school which was built in the city of Sinjar, okay, which was built by the king Qutb ad-Din Muhammad in the year 594 after the Hijrah, okay, who was very known to be very bigoted to the Hanafi school of thought, right? And he stipulated that the school be 100% completely administered solely by Hanafis, by his sons who were Hanafi, to the exclusion of his sons who were Shafi'i, and that even the doorman and the janitor should also follow the Hanafi school of thought. How about the Malikis? Okay, the Malikis, they also had schools and learning institutes that were specific for only teaching and learning their madhab. Okay, they had institutes in Egypt, institutes in Syria, okay, and Damascus and Aleppo, right, in Jerusalem. Okay, one of the famous ones is the Madrasa al-Samsamiyya, okay, and al-Salahiyya, okay, which is found in Damascus, right? Also the Shafi'iyya, okay, the Shafi'iyya, they had their institutes as well, okay. They had a number of jurisprudence schools in Baghdad, in Egypt, in Damascus, Jerusalem, okay, as well as other cities throughout the Islamic world. In Damascus alone, okay, their schools that only taught the Shafi'i madhab numbered about 60, okay. One of the famous ones is Al-Adiliya Al-Kubra, Al-Adiliya Al-Sughra, Al-Usruniya, okay. And some of the schools that they had in Baghdad, right? Al-Madrasa Al-Nizamiya, okay, which is very famous. Many of the scholars of the later generations studied there, right? Madrasa Qarah Dhafar, okay, which was built and, okay, erected by the leaders of that time, right? Also, the one of the Shafi'i schools was built by the king Ghiyath ad-Din al-Ghurri. Okay, he built a Shafi'i school in Herat in the year 595 after the Hijrah, and presented it to Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, right? Who was known to be from amongst the Mutakallimin, who, right, when he presented it to Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, right, many from the Karamiya sect opposed it, okay, and incited the public against him, okay. Also, another merchant, Ibn Rawaha, who died in the year 623 after the Hijrah, he built a school, a Shafi'i school in Damascus. He was known to be a successful businessman, right? But he unfortunately um, put strict conditions, okay, upon who could study in the school. He said no Jew, no Christian, or no Hanbali was allowed to enter the school. And subhanAllah, in this condition that he set, right, he equivalated Muslim Hanbalis to non-Muslim Jews and Christians, right, which was a clear and blatant detestable form of blind fanaticism, bigotry, and group partisanship. Also, the Hanbalis, they had many learning institutions as well in Baghdad and Damascus and Aleppo and other cities in the Islamic world, right? And these, in the schools that were found in Damascus, right? Jawziyya, Di'a'iyya, Umariyya, Alamiyya, okay? In Baghdad, they had Makhrami schools, okay? In Baghdad, they had Mukharrami school, right? Madrasa al-Abradi, Madrasa al-Wazir ibn Hubayra, Madrasa Sayyidah Ben Fasha, okay? And all of these were built and used to teach and propagate certain particular schools of jurisprudence. There were also schools that were mixed. Okay, there were schools that taught several different schools of jurisprudence, right? In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Damascus, okay, such as right Al Muntasiriya and Al Bashiriya in Baghdad, right? Al Salihiyya and Al Mansuriya in Cairo, okay. Um, so even though right these institutions were shared amongst different adherents to jurisprudence madhabs, right, even though they were shared in the terms of buildings and facilities and stipends, each jurisprudence sect, each jurisprudence school, okay, remained separate in its own lecture hall, in its own space, in its own dormitory, its own students, its own teachers, its own fatwa, its own legal orientation, and its own curriculum. So, thus, while these schools may have somewhat reduced, right, intersectarian jurisprudence tension, they also institutionalized division, sectarianism, and fanaticism within a physical structure, within that same building. Okay? So, just how there were institutes that were built promoting only specific schools of jurisprudence, there were also mosques that were built. Okay? Numerous mosques that were built, which one can only teach or learn or propagate a particular madhab, a particular school of jurisprudence. Okay? Um, so in Damascus, in Damascus, Syria, okay, the mosques were divided amongst the four jurisprudence schools. Most of the mosques within the city walls of Damascus were for the Shafi'is, they had the most. Then the Hanafis, they had the second most. Then the Malikis, they had the third most. And the Hanbalis, they had the least. Okay, so most mosques in the Salihiyya district outside the city walls were for the Hanbalis, okay, with the remainder for the Shafi'is and the Hanafis. So, alhamdulillah, excuse me, alhamdulillah. This state of affairs prevailed, okay, and was the most predominant state of affairs in Damascus during the lifetime of the Hanbali jurist Yusuf ibn Abdul Hadi, who died in the year 909 after the Hijrah. And a similar phenomenon occurred also in the city of Marwa, Shahjan in Khorasan, where two adjacent mosques, subhanAllah, were separated by a wall. Two adjacent mosques were separated by a wall, one for Shafi'is and the other for Hanafis. The same applied to Baghdad and Harran, where these sectarian mosques based on schools of jurisprudence, okay, were found within the city. Now, can you imagine that? Okay, we can kind of fathom and imagine that, okay, within one city there is 4 or 5 different mosques, each one adhering to a particular school of jurisprudence. But imagine there being multiple mihrabs in one single mosque. This is from the evil results, the negative results of sectarianism, bigotry, partisanship, and blind following. Okay, so this is even more disappointing, right, and astonishing. The existence of multiple mihrabs, multiple prayer niches within one single mosque, designated for different madhabs. Each group would perform prayer at its own mihrab and would not pray at other mihrabs. The Shafi'i would not pray in the Hanafi mihrab, the Hanafi would not pray in the Hanbali mihrab, the Hanbali would not pray in the Maliki mihrab, the Maliki would not pray in the Hanbali mihrab, or nor would they pray behind the other imams. And even in Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, there were 5 mihrabs. 5 mihrabs corresponding to the different jurisprudence sects and one basically ideological sect. The Shafi'is had their own mihrab, their own side of the Kaaba. The Hanafis had their mihrab in the Kaaba. The Malikis had their mihrab in the Kaaba. The Hanbalis had their mihrab in the Kaaba. And the Zaydiyya Shia had their mihrab in the Kaaba. So each group would perform their prayers in their own specific areas. And during Maghrib prayer, all of the different madhabs would pray simultaneously due to the shortness of time for Maghrib, resulting in confusion in bowing, in prostration, right, in the salam. And this phenomenon was present in the 6th century and even later, right? Some of the scholars mentioned that it remained like that, 4 or 5 mihrabs inside the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca for over 800 years, from the 4th, 5th century Hijri all the way up until the 12th century Hijri. And then with the coming, one of the great things of the coming of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the Muhammad al-Saud, right, is that they removed these mihrabs and united and gathered the people upon one imam to pray behind one imam. Now, subhanAllah, it's very hard to imagine that, in Mecca, in the Masjid al-Haram, that, there were 4 different mihrabs. But unfortunately, because of bigotry, because of blind following, because of partisanship, it led people to that. And not only in the Masjid al-Haram, another sacred mosque as well. Another sacred mosque, Masjid al-Aqsa, was also divided amongst the different schools of jurisprudence, each having its own mihrab and own dedicated teaching circles and teaching corners. Okay? And this also occurred in the Khalil Mosque, which was also divided, right? Except that the Hanbalis, they had no official imam there. Also in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, there were 4 mihrabs, each designated for one of the 4, right, Sunni schools of jurisprudence. For each used them for prayer and social gatherings, okay? And these mihrabs, they remain present in the mosque up until today as historical markers, and though they are no longer in use except for one, which is used by all. And Ali al-Tantawi, he mentioned in his book Al-Jami' al-Amawi or al-Umawi, okay, some of the scholars differ in the pronunciation of it, fi Dimashq, describing the situation in the masjid in Damascus. He goes on to say, he says, in the year 617 after the Hijrah, the Hanbali mihrab was installed in the 3rd western portico near the well, behind the 3rd row of columns. Some opposed its installation, but Rukn ad-Din al-Mu'azzami or al-Mu'azzami supported the Hanbalis, and al-Muwaffaq ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi led the prayer there. The mihrab was removed around 730 after the Hijrah and replaced by the western mihrab near Bab az-Ziyada, which still exists. The current Shafi'i mihrab was built in 728 after the Hijrah by order of Tankiz and was later assigned to the Hanafis. Thus, the mosque had 4 mihrabs: the Khatib's mihrab, the Hanafi mihrab, originally Shafi'i, the Maliki mihrab, and the Hanbali mihrab. Before 694 after the Hijrah, all madhabs prayed simultaneously, subhanAllah, together at the same time. Later, the Hanbalis were ordered to pray before the chief imam, and by 819 after the Hijrah, the first imam moved from the Maliki mihrab to the Hanafi mihrab, now the Shafi'i one. Eventually, prayer order settled as follows: Imam of the Kalasa, Imam of Mashhad al-Hussein, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, Imam of Mashhad Abu Bakr, Imam of Mashhad Urwa, Imam of Mashhad Uthman, and it was later limited to the 4 official imams in this same order. End of his quote. And the great historian al-Maqrizi, who died in the year 845, he said in his book Al-Mawa'idh wal-I'tibar, he said during the reign of Sultan al-Zahir Bibris al-Bunduqdari, 4 judges were appointed in Egypt, one for each of the 4 madhabs, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali. This arrangement began in 665 after the Hijrah and remained in place throughout the Muslim world, to the extent that no madhab outside of these 4 were recognized. Schools, learning institutes, zawiyas, and ribats were dedicated to adherents of these 4 schools across all Islamic lands. And anyone who followed a different school of jurisprudence was opposed and censured and boycotted. No judge was appointed, nor was any testimony accepted, nor was anyone allowed to deliver sermons or lead prayers unless they adhered to one of the 4 madhabs. And for centuries, the jurists of the Islamic cities ruled that it was obligatory to follow one of these 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence and prohibited to follow any other. Thus, that's the end of Maqrizi's quote. So thus, brothers and sisters, adherence to these 4 madhabs and no others became the norm, especially after the sultans, the limited religious teaching and judicial positions to scholars affiliated with them. The scholars that didn't have affiliation with the sultan, their books or their teachings weren't promoted, their classes weren't promoted, their lectures weren't promoted. And this remained the case until al-Zahir Bibris, who ruled over Egypt and Sham and other Muslim lands, decreed in 663 after the Hijrah that there be 4 judges in Egypt, each one for each Islamic school of jurisprudence. And in the following year, the same thing was done in Sham. And Ibn Kathir mentioned in Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, he said, then came the year 664 after the Hijrah, and the Abbasid Caliph was Al-Hakim, and the Sultan was Al-Malik al-Zahir. Egypt had 4 judges, and in the same year Damascus was also assigned 4 judges, one from each madhab, and had been done in Egypt the year before. This act, unprecedented in history, became the new norm. So what can we conclude, brothers and sisters? So from what we have discussed and what we have talked about, right, it is clear that the phenomenon of distinct schools and mosques for each jurisprudence madhab was widespread throughout Islamic history. And it reflected the depth of sectarian division amongst the Muslims. Amongst many, it reflected the bigotry, the blind following, and the sectarianism amongst them. And in turn, this only intensified and institutionalized that division and separation due to the dominance of sectarian fanaticism and the failure of many scholars and rulers and governors to fulfill their duties to unite the Muslim Ummah and call them to true Itibaa of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, an abandonment of bigotry and blind following of people, of fallible men, of fallible ideas, of fallible views and opinions, of fallible schools of thought. So in our upcoming talk, we're going to elaborate a little bit about what occurred, okay, between some of the scholars, okay, showing their fanaticism towards their particular madhab, okay. And you know, let's just talk about that now, okay. So to further illustrate the extent of madhab fanaticism amongst some people of knowledge and scholars, we want to list a few figures known for their partisanship, known for their bigotry, known for their blind following, and known for their fanaticism. One of them was Al-Qadi Al-Hasan ibn Ali Al-Tanuhi Al-Baghdadi, who died in the year 372 after the Hijrah. He was, right, very, very bigoted, okay, to the Hanafi madhab, and known for his harsh statements, very vulgar speech against Imam al-Shafi'i and the Shafi'i madhab. And you can return back to his books, right, and open them up, and you will see inside. Okay, if you go back to Al-Kamil by Ibn Athir, okay, you'll find that Ibn Athir talks about that. The next scholar or jurist who was considered extremely bigoted to his madhab, right, was the Hanafi jurist, Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Balazaguni, al-Turki, okay, who died in the year 506 after the Hijrah. He was very extreme in his bigotry and blind following of the Hanafi madhab and his loyalty to the Hanafi madhab. And he always attacked the Shafi'is, right? So much so, his bigotry is manifested, right? So much so where he said, if I held political authority or if I was a governor or in the government, I would levy the jizya upon the Shafi'is. Subhanallah. Jizya. Jizya upon another Muslim, equating them to the level of non-Muslim dhimmis. Subhanallah, from his extremism and level of bigotry, he's equivalating those who follow the Shafi'i madhab in jurisprudence to non-Muslims, to dhimmis, and they have to pay jizya. Subhanallah. Another example was Abu al-Hujjaj Yusuf ibn Dunas al-Qandalawi al-Maliki al-Maghribi, who died in the year 543 after the Hijrah. Okay, كان معجم البلدان. Okay, this is mentioned in معجم البلدان. We'll read it in Arabic. كان شديد التعصب لمذهب الأشعري وصاحب تحرق على الحنابلة. He was, okay, he was fiercely loyal to the Ash'ari creed, okay, one of the misguided groups, right, that left the creed of the main body of Muslims, and he was known for his extreme hatred and dislike and, right, foul speech about the Hanbalis. Another, Al-Faqih Al-Shafi'i Abu Muzaffar Muhammad ibn Muhammad Al-Buruwi, كان شديد التعصب على الحنابلة والتحامل عليهم حتى أنه كان يقول لو أن لي أمر لوضعت على الحنابلة الجزية. Okay, similarly to what, right, one of the bigoted scholars of the Hanafiya said. So this, right, Shafi'i jurist Abu Muzaffar Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Barawi, right, known for his harshness and extremity against the Hanbalis, he said, if I had authority, I would impose the jizya on the Hanbalis. Subhanallah, jizya upon another Muslim, jizya upon the Hanbalis. Subhanallah. Right, again, right, you find scholars treating other Muslims as dhimmis because of their bigotry, their blind following, right? And due to his hostility, they say a group of the Hanbalis allegedly sent him a gift laced with poison, subhanallah, resulting in his death. So you see bigotry from both sides. Bigotry from both sides. a jurist who adheres to and follows the Shafi'i madhab, calling another Muslim who adheres to another school of jurisprudence a dhimmi. And then in return, they send poison, which results in his death. Another bigoted scholar, Judge Amir Katib ibn Umar al-Hanafi, who died in the year 758 after the Hijrah. His intensely self-admiring of the Hanafis and fierce loyalty, bigotry, and blind following of the Hanafis, was clearly shown in his hostility and enmity towards the Shafi'is. He lobbied political authorities in Egypt and Sham to eliminate the Shafi'is, but failed in his attempt to do so. And one of the last examples we're going to mention is the Hanafi scholar Muhibbuddin Muhammad ibn Muhammad ad-Dimqurani al-Hindi, who died in the year 789 after the Hijrah. He was also deeply fanatical and bigoted to the Hanafi madhab, and constantly and consistently and frequently insulting Imam al-Shafi'i, and believed that criticizing Imam al-Shafi'i and the Shafi'is and those who adhere to the Shafi'i madhab was a form of worship, was ibadah. So from all of this, brothers and sisters, it should be evident and clear that fanaticism towards one particular school of thought, bigotry to personalities, to scholars, to one scholar in being bigoted to one scholar and then abandoning all the other scholars, and blind following. Okay, so madhab fanaticism, partisanship, bigotry, and blind following, as we observed, deeply penetrated the ranks of Muslims and unfortunately reached many Muslim scholars across different Islamic schools of jurisprudence and different disciplines, which led to conflict amongst Muslims, mutual insults amongst Muslims, alienation amongst Muslims, infighting amongst Muslims, poisoning amongst Muslims, equivalating people to non-Muslims, Ahlul Dhimma amongst Muslims. So many scholars succumbed to intellectual and behavioral deviation, thereby solidifying madhab fanaticism within Islamic societies and transmitting it to both the elite and the general population. So hopefully it's becoming more clearer to all of us the harms of bigotry to personalities, to individuals, to certain madhahibs, in the exception of other madhahibs or people or personalities. So in our next topic, our next discussion, next talk, we're going to talk about some of the trials, some of the ordeals, some of the tribulations and tortures experienced by some of the great scholars of the past at the hands of the bigoted blind followers and fanatics to certain madhahibs, and their sectarian, and doctrinal fanatics. So until next time, jazakumullahu khairan, wa barakallahu feek, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.